I have great pleasure in introducing the amazing Rick Dale, who is my colleague at the University of California, Merced. So part of the idea of this summer school was to integrate what we've learned from the dynamics of music with what we know about the dynamics of language. Rick has actually been doing path-breaking work in sort of taking language from just traditional laboratory-style experiments to actually looking at language's interaction and social function. So he has borrowed tools from people doing action dynamics, and he's looked at language and linguistic behaviors such as conversation. And today, what he's going to teach us is going to hopefully help us understand how music might be understood from the same social perspective, and how we might understand how musicians interact and how musicians interact with the audience. So I give the floor to the amazing Rick Dale, who's going to talk about the dynamics of multimodal language.
Thank you. Can you, thanks Ramesh. Can you, sounds pretty good. Is that okay? All right, awesome. Okay, so first, a very non-perfunctory thank you to the organizers and wonderful colleagues, Ramesh, Tini, and Chris, and to everyone attending. It's been fun interacting with many of you, and I look forward to interacting further. And then, of course, the past 2 days of talks, they've been great and very edifying and interesting. In fact, going later on in a conference is a bit torturous because you end up tinkering with your slides constantly as you're seeing things and realizing the fundamental flaws in all of your work as you're seeing all this fascinating stuff on language. And I would like to say, just in response to what Ramesh suggested, it would be interesting to have conversations after this in thinking about human interaction in terms of musical interaction, in fact. And there's some of you in the room who've done just this, so we can hopefully engage in these kinds of interactions. So Ed's talk started with his general approach, so I thought I'd toss in a slide to motivate some of the general ideas here. And I am by training an experimental psycholinguist, and in the past 5 or so years, I've been interested with collaborators and students in embedding human beings in relatively natural circumstances, but trying to extract dynamic signatures from these interacting individuals, and in some sense, in some ways, quantifying the dynamics that hold among the behaviors that those individuals exhibit. And so we do like to use simple, flexible methods for quantifying dynamics, and I mean dynamics in this talk in a very generic sort of way. That is, we're very interested in structure and time. So anything that looks to time as an extremely important variable in analyzing the structure of behavior rather than simply aggregating it or having behavioral counts within interactions, but rather focusing on the dynamic structure of interaction, that's what I mean by focusing on dynamics. Of course, we saw in the last wonderful talk that by making some awesome assumptions in dynamical systems theory and various guises, you can develop incredible formal models. In this case, by comparison, in some sense, I'm sort of lowering your expectations here. The methods will be relatively simple, but in that sense flexible for analyzing the multiple behaviors that make up human interaction, because they come in many kinds. And so the reason that this is of interest, I can express in the following way, and I lifted this from Pierre's talk actually, almost verbatim, because I thought it was so interesting as he framed his own talk. And so I've taken it as verbatim as I could in my little Ernest Hemingway notepad that some of you have as well. And I just substituted language for music. So language is this behavioral repertoire that is structured by multiple processes. It's a multi-level process that structures linguistic performance. And language is extended in time with a degree of structural complexity that we wish to embrace. And so the focus here, I think that I would make the strong argument, and it would be interesting to get into discussion about this, that focusing on dynamics of interaction has always been there, sort of humming in the background of a lot of theories of human discourse and interaction. But now with the techniques that we have, both in terms of automated behavioral measurement and some kinds of time series analyses that I'm going to showcase to you, we can now quantify these processes and really try to embrace that structural complexity in time. And so to start in a fun way to emphasize the importance of multi-level processes, I'm going to start by caricaturing this wonderful, being at UC Merced, you get the good fortune of having great colleagues like Chris Keller, who have great students like Drew Abney, who's right over there. And he has this great paper that starts, it's an empirical exploration of the multi-scale nature of language. And I'm going to caricature this, this expression Drew has for the multi-scale nature of language by looking at an extremely important linguistic context that we all probably experience together. And this is one of the presidential debates. And so this is Mitt Romney in debate 1 with Obama. Romney v. Obama, debate won in 2012. And now we can sort of resolve Romney into a variety of timescales, and these timescales may reflect various levels of analysis in linguistic theory. So here is Romney uttering a vowel. Now, okay, simple, short behavior. But we see at this timescale, which is just a couple of dozen milliseconds, he's already marshaled this suite of muscles in his vocal articulators to engage in this sort of quasi-stable regime that's going to rapidly transition into another. Now, he also has available to him this manual modality, within which, even in this short gesture that I have on loop here, even in here, there's enough time for many of those vocal regimes, quasi-stable regimes, to have come and gone already. And he's doing the gesture all at the same time. And so now we have multiple modalities that are at play here, all being dynamically structured. The vowels are folded into, they're nested into the gesture. This is a fundamental characteristic of language, is this multi-scale nested system. And of course, those two kinds of processes together play a role when they're linearized in one sort of coherent performance that we typically refer to as a sentence that has some sort of meaning or significance. And here's a very famous statement that Romney made in this debate, in which this gesture and this vowel only play just one small part of the broader texture.
I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS.
So Romney proclaims he's going to be part of the, because Romney, seemingly incredibly reasonable person up until sort of those twilight moments in the election, when you have to sort of satisfy some far-right folks. I should promise myself I wouldn't talk about this, but anyway, I can't help it, because what happens in this moment, of course, if any of you remember this debate, is that this other process that now we have to suppose, because there's overwhelming evidence for this, and it'd be interesting if there are any folks disagreeing with this in here, because there are several of us who could have a discussion about this, that social processes are a crucial component of language production and comprehension as well. So as Romney utters the statement about PBS, he realizes, and you can see this in the vivid characteristic of his gestures, and his articulation seems to take on a more exaggerated form, as he sort of very carefully realizes that the moderator, Jim Lehrer, is an employee and executive producer at PBS. As you can see here,
I'm going to stop the subsidy to PBS. I'm going to stop other things. I like PBS. I love Big Bird.
So there's overwhelming evidence that human beings utilize these social experiences. And by utilize, it almost sounds overly instrumental. They are part of the linguistic process. And so, we can identify, fundamental levels of linguistic organization, such as phonetic acoustics. But those are all folded into or enfolded in nested structure that even leads to others of our conspecifics who are around us in determining those dynamics that we exhibit. And this is a fundamental characteristic of human language, and one might say of any complex human cognitive performance. And coming to fundamentally understand the way these processes weave together and coordinate complex behavior might be regarded as sort of a broader scientific problem of coordination of life itself, I suppose. But I'm especially intrigued by the incredible multi-scale nature of language, as is Drew in that very nice paper. Now, the reason I decided to use the debate here to exemplify this is not just for fun, but also because another wonderful project with Tini Matlock and some other collaborators like Carter Fuzzaroli, we wanted to see if this sort of multi-scale entrainment or this multi-scale dynamic cascades well out from just those people who happen to be co-present with you during this moment. So it goes well beyond Jim Lehrer or those folks in attendance. Having a forum such as the presidential debate cascades out into a whole realm of social media now. So, and any of us with a Twitter account can engage in this sort of mutual linguistic influence while we talk. But what we did with Alan Mislove, who's a computer scientist at Northeastern, he collects a massive database of Twitter feeds so that we can look over the course of the interaction here. Let me explain the axes first here. And so the idea here is that, and this is thanks to incredible lab coding that Fuzzaroli did at a millisecond timescale, identifying interesting events that took place in the interaction, the debate between Obama and and Romney, including even interruptions. So this was talked about pretty extensively at that time as an important part of their interactions. They kept interrupting each other. And with Alan Mislav's database, we were able to extract mentions to Obama and mentions to Romney. And we can, at a second timescale, we time-locked this to the C-SPAN video, which was coded. And we look at this sort of ebb and flow of the tweet rate to these two individuals. So you can see red is Romney, tweets to Romney, blue is tweets to Obama, and there's this general ebb and flow as Obama takes the floor, tweets to Obama increase, as Romney takes the floor, tweets to Romney increase. And this happens at a time scale of 10 to 20 seconds. There's this sort of dynamic oscillation, massive social entrainment. In fact, interestingly, just using a nice simple regression model, we're able to see that during interruptions in these debates, the tweet rate gets amplified. So it seems that this very broad scale, this massive social scale, is also entrained to these massive shared events. And in fact, we give a look at the time scale of the emergence of a meme. So here is the tweet rate on the phrase Big Bird. At the onset, we've time locked this at a second time scale. And so at the onset of mention, you have this rapid amplification of mentions of Big Bird, which ends up decaying but then stabilizing at this sort of hum of social attention. And this takes, so we looked at a variety of these memes, and this happens in 5 to 15 seconds if it's sufficiently interesting. And so the idea here, I'm going to head back into multimodal land, sort of properly construed in the linguistic context in a moment. But the idea here, of course, is that in the ecology of entrainment, in the modern ecology of linguistic entrainment, it's massively multi-scale, from having a dyadic interaction to having an interaction among groups of people, and even massive groups of people. So this is a nice paper that I really like, this theoretical description of entrainment in rhythm among people. And Gray Bryant, Jessica Phillips over on this paper, and they conceive of human beings as entrainable systems. And so the idea in this just very simple and elegant model is that we receive rhythmic input in our social environment. In response, we generate it, which is of course received by other entrainable systems as rhythmic input. When you allow this to cascade over members of your community, you can achieve various forms of stable entrainment. Now the issue, of course, is that these entrainable systems, as I just described, are already multi-scale themselves. So the entrainability of the human linguistic system lies across many levels, from the sounds of our language to the words we choose and the topics of conversation we wish to discuss. So these entrainable systems are multi-scale already. And then, as I just described, when you have a forum such as this, or any of us who have a Twitter feed with sufficient followers or whatever sorts of cool things you can... Who has a Twitter feed that uses it actively? I'm just curious. Oh, no one wishes to confess. Interesting. But the idea is you're contributing to this, I don't know, this swarm computing that's taking place out there. But this is a genuine entrainable system at this larger scale because, of course, pundits or aides, political aides, or whatever they all sort of blend together these days, depending on the news network. But the idea is that they may take the centroid of that sort of massive social attention and the things that they say. Their language itself, these folks reflecting on this, who are just sort of various versions of what's taking place at this massive scale, the things that they say may then feed back onto the subsequent debate. So there's a fundamental sense in which these are genuine causally interacting systems that are influencing each other in time. So human language is this massively multimodal, multi-scale system. Now this isn't, so I really wanted to sort of caricature in extreme terms just the wealth of complexity of human linguistic performance. But I would say that this traditional and still dominant approach, I think, still holds considerable sway, especially among us who focus on language, because we tend to still focus on the debates. First of all, we focus on specific structures and kinds of events taking place through analysis of the linguistic stream. And that's partly influenced by these long-standing assumptions for how we should conduct a science of language. And my favorite, the way that the Chomsky approach has, in a sense, propagated itself is by generating a whole variety of theoretical constraints and dichotomies and concepts that essentially constrain the kinds of questions that we can ask. So my favorite is the ideal speaker here. This is the idea that any theory of language ought to be a theory of the ideal speaker here. And of course, it's sort of almost a misnomer because there's no interaction in these theories, so speaker here should not be placed in juxtaposition in this technical term. Now, it turns out on Google Images, you can easily find the ideal speaker and ideal hearer. So here's the ideal speaker in the Chomsky context. Here's the ideal listener. And so there's no rich dynamic interaction taking place in these classic approaches. That's not to say that they haven't contributed significant advances in terms of understanding the structure and some of the fundamental problems that are present in language. But what's been done, which is quite at the detriment of our field, quite frankly, is that they've encouraged us not to look beyond those things, which is obnoxious and, quite frankly, ridiculous. Annoying. In fact, you can find these fantastic quotes back in the heyday, before machine learning emerged, where you can find such quotes as saying that, statistical models will do nothing, we should ignore them. And I think that, they've now formed the basis of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of, internet activity on natural language processing and so on. But nevertheless, this sort of theoretical approach comes in our field, and it resonates in various places. One such place is in theories of language evolution. So is anyone familiar with this paper? This is Mark Hauser, Noam Chomsky, and Tecumseh Fitch, where they're really trying to articulate what's unique to human language. What do we have that these other poor creatures don't have, besides, of course, synchronizing, which maybe will prove wrong. But the idea is that they're sort of identifying all these other things many of us in this room are interested in, which they refer to as the faculty of language in a broad sense, which other animals have, such as conceptual intentional systems, sensory motor systems, and so on. And they identify the true core, the true kernel of linguistic competence, which is the capacity to engage in recursive functions in cognitive processing. And so here the idea still is to sort of solve this fundamental puzzle of human language. And Ray Jackanoff and it's wonderful seeing in some domains of linguistics some exasperation of this kind of scientific strategy. So Ray Jackanoff would refer to this, and Ray Jackanoff himself, being very much a sort of structurally inclined individual, he would refer to this as a kind of syntactocentrism. So this idea for the past several decades in language research that we're trying to figure out the puzzle of the linguistic recursion. But the multi-level story I just told you, I think, lays out a much broader puzzle that's typically not even recognized, I think. And so that puzzle is simply the multimodal and multi-scale constitution of human language and how we're capable of marshalling simultaneously all of these complex processes that are all theoretically feasible degrees of freedom unto themselves, but they become constrained actively in any coherent linguistic performance. And so I know this is a little bit overly provocative, but it is an animation in Keynote, so I have to do this. I apologize to those, and I can tell by some of your faces some generativists in the room. That's okay. There you go. Yeah, sorry. Whatever. So now, if you look at this is, I think, a much broader puzzle that tends to be ignored, and it's one that's been articulated pretty explicitly in the domain of motor control. And that is when we look at even just a minute of interaction between people, all of those scales are involved simultaneously. And it's not merely the perceptual motor levels, but these incredibly high abstract levels of control. The words I choose to use, the topics of conversation I want to decide upon, and how we're going to sequence that together, and how I'm going to actively adapt to you as a member of this little linguistic exchange we're going to engage in. That's an extremely complicated problem, and how all of those components operate together, sometimes referred to in other domains as a degrees of freedom problem or Bernstein's problem, but this is a problem in a linguistic context as well. And of course, we can see this echoing, this general issue echoing out in music research as well, which is given to its own important kind of experimental analysis with tapping, work that explores Carl Palmer's work on piano performance, where social processes may come into play more actively, and then something akin to that massive social scale entrainment in musical performance. And one of my favorite studies recently is this work by Adriano Barbosa and Eric Vadakiris-Bateson. They're at UBC at the time. Eric's still there. Adriano has moved on, I believe. But what they did is they took YouTube videos, and this is an example, their famous one that was, I guess, highlighted in the press. They used video analysis. They extracted vector fields, and they call this optic flow analysis. And this is Freddie Mercury, and by tracking Freddie Mercury's movements in a vector field, and then tracking the movements of these pixels, Eric Vadakiris-Bateson identified the large-scale entrainment between this massive social system and Freddie Mercury as he's doing his awesome thing. So as I'm saying, within 1 minute of linguistic interaction, we're seeing these multiple scales play out. So this is the idea of the dynamics of multimodal language. This is why I'm fundamentally interested in essentially Bernstein's problem at the level of linguistic description. So what I'm going to argue today is essentially, I'm not going to in any way even come remotely close to a solution to Bernstein's problem. But the idea is that some of the initial steps we've been taking to think in this way and analyze language in this way, and some of the themes that are going to come up in the empirical studies I'm going to show you is a kind of multi-scale interdependence. So what's actually assumed in these contexts, in the context of synchrony in one case, but also when you have maybe more complex kinds of articulators or systems that are interacting, you have this pattern of interdependence between systems or among systems that generate a kind of systematic temporal structure among those components. So you have, as I'm talking to you now, it's quite possible for many of the components that make up my linguistic system to flail about unto themselves in the wind. But they don't, at least not entirely, because they're mutually constraining each other. There's this multi-scale interdependence among the components that make up me while I'm talking with you. And so in this dynamic performance, they show relative systematic temporal structure, and then in the end I'm going to try to reframe some of this issue in the linguistic sphere by describing what I'll call the centipede's dilemma, which is just my sort of ripping off Bernstein and renaming it in some way. So the idea of multi-scale independence here is that I can take a relatively low-level channel, such as your eye movements, and by looking at the dynamics of those eye movements, those dynamics of this potentially just incidental system that's moving about while you're talking to other people, that it's not incidental at all. In fact, it's quite structured in its covariation with what's taking place at the higher level. So your eye movements are actually going to show systematic covariation with stuff at the higher level. And then conversely, when we look at what's taking place at the higher level as variation takes place at the level of discourse, we're going to see this cascading effect on all the other channels that compose the lower level stuff. So we're getting this multi-level interdependence among systems. And so this would suggest that some concept like a synergy or some sort of self-organization is suitable in the case of high-level conversational interaction. And so the way I'm going to convey this to you is in two series of studies.